There was everything in this polyglot camp which we crisscrossed in every direction. Everything, that is, except a pair of wheels for a 37, which we would have snatched away without the slightest scruple. But in vain did we scour all the corners, under trailers, on caissons, around harnesses. Nothing, always nothing. And the day of our relief was approaching. Finally, one night, the rationers of a front-line gun woke us up when they came back and assured us that they had seen, on a trailer at Maurepas, beside the road, a miraculous thing for USA pair of wheels for a 37. To be sure, the wheels appeared to be firmly stowed on the trailer, under which stretched a greyish shape which could well be the driver, watching his load and sleeping with one eye open. But we, the 4 larceny victims, were determined. I blush with shame to be writing these lines. We armed ourselves with a saw and a hatchet to detach the wheels, and a towel and some rope with which to bind and gag the driver if he tried to interfere. Like 4 bandits up to no good, we left at midnight for Maurepas, where we easily found the trailer upon which the enticing wheels were perched. Climb up onto the vehicle, saw through the cord, carry off the wheels on our shoulders, all this took barely 2 minutes, without seeing a soul. We hastened toward Hardcourt, happy as a gang of thieves carrying off a strongbox without the slightest remorse, and probably none of us had ever stolen even a cherry. Ah, war the great moralizer. One day, unexpectedly, 2 arms wrapped around my neck and somebody planted kisses on both of my cheeks. It was one of my former little bleus, Victor Grandjean, a young Parisian orphan. He was my favourite, he called me Papa. The other Périac Poilus took an interest in him too. His battalion was in relief near Combles, so he took an excursion to see me. He told me about the horrible death of the little Breton, Maurice Yver, blown to bits by an enormous shell, along with a comrade and the corporal who had replaced me in the squad, in a hole where the 3 of them had burrowed. Périac's Paul Alpec had been in this hole right before. It was 9 in the evening. They were calling the rationers to go pick up supplies near Combles. Paul Alpech, who had kept with my successor the functions of rationer, left the hole to gather up pots, pans, and other containers. Maurice Yver immediately took his place in the hole. 2 or 3 minutes later, the drama occurred. That is how, in war, fate and luck play out, so that the life and death of a man can hang on the tiniest of circumstances. He told me about the unspeakable horrors, in the trenches transformed by frequent downpours into muddy open sewers, and the terrible cold which froze always damp feet. In the Squad de Lâtre, who was from Lille and whose lamentable story I will tell, Maurice Jouy, Peyron and Flamande had been evacuated with frozen feet. Given our enormous losses, we expected to be brought back to the rear, but alas, on October 31st, our 4th Battalion received orders to go back up to the front line that night, along with our field gun. When we were getting our mule Fallet ready to haul our cannon and munitions, the Marshal of Dragoons, who commanded the cavalry detachment, declared outright that the road from Maurepas to Combles was too dangerous. No mules could be spared to help us out. For us simple bipeds, this had no importance. There were endless supplies of men, as many as they could want, but it was getting harder and harder to procure mules. They had to be carefully husbanded. This would have obliged us to drag along the load with ropes, to push and pull our gun carriage several kilometres, along terrible roads. But necessity breeds boldness. At the moment of our departure, in darkest night, we went and quietly untied our mule, which was kept out in the open under the watch of an inattentive stable guard, snuggled comfortably in a nook made of piled-up harnesses and horse collars. Everything went fine as far as Maurepas, but from there on, Fallet began to balk at going any farther, slowed his pace, and ended up stopping altogether, in spite of our urgent exhortations, and even some caresses from a stout club. Nobody had ever seen such a stubborn mule. Deep down, maybe he was too intelligent. He sniffed danger from afar. That night he wasn't mistaken. The road was bombarded, mainly at certain places which the gun teams crossed at a gallop, even a triple gallop. All of a sudden, 200 metres ahead of us, a shell fell upon the road, right in the midst of a group of territorials going off to work. When we passed by, they were taking care of the victims. A dozen of them who showed signs of life were hoisted onto a passing artillery wagon. As for the others, who had breathed their last, we counted 8 of them. They weren't worth being hauled off. They were lined up along the roadside for a quick burial. C'est la guerre. An accident like that in peacetime would have taken up plenty of space in the newspapers for several days, but now it was just a simple, everyday accident. You might say that the impact of this shell made our mule understand that he had to pick up the pace. In fact, we now had trouble keeping up with him. After passing through Combles, when there was no more road to follow, we had to carry the field gun and its accessories up to the front line on our shoulders. That night, our artillery pounded away with an unusual violence. All of our batteries, and those of the English on our left, threw out an avalanche of iron and fire onto the German lines. The air was filled with the deafening shrieks of shells and the pulsating vibrations of explosions. The firing guns and bursting shells made an uninterrupted roar. No matter how accustomed we were to the cannonade's rumble, a storm like this rattled our brains, burrowed into our skulls, pressed down upon our chests with a pervasive anguish. We were dazed, stumbling around like sleepwalkers. This frightful bombardment, in which more cannon shots were fired in one night than in a whole campaign of Napoleon's, was in preparation for an offensive which our corps d'armée was to undertake the next day. They had kept this decision under wraps until the very last moment. The men, very tired, badly fed, stuck in muddy trenches, greeted the attack order with grumbling. Many slipped away from the front lines under the pretext of being overwhelmed by shell fire, or falling ill, or having frozen feet, whether true or not. These men, who weren't seduced by the idea of a bayonet charge, chose to stay put once they reached the field kitchens or the first aid stations, or else they wandered off and were in no hurry to find the right road. Not everyone can be a hero. At 9 in the morning on November 1st, the order was given to go forth from the trenches. There was a moment of hesitation, but on our left the 125th Regiment went out with élan and swept right over the first German line. 14th Notebook. In the blood-soaked mud of the Somme, November 1st, 1916. January 30th, 1917. Seeing that they were being outflanked by the 125th Regiment, the Germans came out of their holes with arms raised, calling out, "Comrades! Comrades!" This word is now known in all languages. Their obliging machine gunners carried their murderous machines across their shoulders. Some comical scenes occurred. There was rivalry between the 125th and the 296th Regiments over who could gather up the most prisoners. Pulled and tugged first one way, then the other, the prisoners didn't know whom to follow. Dazed, they understood nothing about the animated discussions among ourselves, which sometimes degenerated into quarrels and came close to fisticuffs. Some Germans, profiting from this confusion, scrambled away or hid themselves in shell holes. Finally, the prisoners were led to the rear, and we took over the German positions. It was quite a while before the German command noticed the loss of their front line. Under the cover of thick fog, which the sun had not yet penetrated, a leader with any initiative could have taken the second German line even more easily than the first. But where were our great leaders, the general or the colonel? Nobody saw them. Prudently they had burrowed into their holes. There was nobody qualified on hand to give orders, to take advantage of circumstances, to alert the artillery to lengthen their range. We stayed in place. Around noon, the weather cleared. The Germans then saw that their positions were occupied by us, and they organized their second line, now their front line. They didn't counterattack, but they rained shell fire of all calibers onto the lost ground, making us pay rather dearly for the day's success. On November 2nd and 3, some heavy downpours and a cold temperature made the sojourn of the men in these mixed-up positions even tougher. On top of long hours of guard duty and patrol, they were sent out to dig, to undergo work details day and night, without sleep, badly fed. It was with a keen sigh of satisfaction that they welcomed the order for their relief, which took place in the night of the 3rd 4th by another regiment in our army corps. At 6 in the morning, the 4th Battalion, to which our group was attached, arrived at Hardecourt. The men's fatigue was extreme, but we had to cover 2 more hours of marching before reaching Suzanne, where trucks awaited us. The traffic jams were such that they could not have reached Hardecourt without great difficulty. Suzanne is, or rather was, a nice village grouped around some fine chateaux. German shells had wrought great damage, and still did so, despite our advance. We had to wait for the lame, the halt, the laggards, those with frozen feet. I took advantage of it to visit the village. The church's steeple was intact, but half of the vaulting had collapsed. With the rubble cleared away, the church was still used for regular services. In a chapel were buried under the paving stones several generations of counts, dukes, marquis, lieutenants, captains-at-arms of the most powerful lords of Suzanne, Cappy, and other places. By fate, up to that time no projectile had profaned this place of burial, which could happen one day or another. I had the time to visit a magnificent chateau near the church, with beautiful staircases, galleries, panelling, tapestries, etc. At 10 o'clock the trucks headed out, and at 3 in the afternoon they dropped us off at Aubigny, a little village 2 kilometres from Corbie beside the Somme. We had, for our billet, a huge barn which had long served as lodging for troops. The only furniture was, along each side, a camp bed, like in a police station. Upon each plank, some scraps of straw. As always, our accommodation was in the sorriest imaginable state of cleanliness. The walls, built of entorches, wattle and daub, were full of holes, letting in numerous cold draughts, just like a dozen or so ventilators. Even worse, the roof was pierced with openings. Rain falling from the sky had formed a pond in the bottom of the shed. The ground sloped down from the courtyard and its inevitable manure pile. The juice, the extract, the liquid manure from this dung heap seeped into the pond and fed it with germs, and every day at this time the newspapers stuffed their readers' heads with incessant elegies about the care, the well-being, the hygiene, the comfort which enveloped the poilus when they came back from the trenches. It must be said that they did give us a second blanket, which made our packs heavier on the march, but which were very useful to us when we shivered from the cold at night. The weather was bad at this time. Rain, snow, heavy frosts. Along one wall in the barn's courtyard were the company's mules, the poor beasts. Without the slightest shelter, submissive, resigned, tethered next to one another, they bore these rigorous conditions, also martyrs to this cataclysm without the means to complain, arousing no sentiment of pity because they were mere beasts, as if the suffering of animals wasn't the same as that of men. Society for the Protection of Animals, where were you? What were you doing then? What were the casualty figures of the regiment, of our battalion, of our company? They were careful not to say. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to set them at 200 dead, 300 wounded, and 100 evacuated as sick or with frostbitten feet. From the 7th, the divisional depot sent up all its available replacements. A reinforcement of 200 men arrived from the training camp at Troyes. They were made up of bakery workers, pastry chefs, typists, etc., now replaced by people who were lucky enough to have come into the world 2 or 3 years earlier than they did. Of these 2 reinforcements, few were from the Midi. The regiment therefore lost more and more of its southern character. For several days at assembly, it was a downpour of honours and congratulations. General of the division, of the brigade, colonel each one paying his compliments, exalting our courage, our warlike virtues, our ferocious energy. We were dying with laughter. With you, one can, one should, dare all, said one. With men like you, all hopes are permitted, affirmed another in all seriousness. Finally, it was officially recognised and proclaimed that our battalion, the 4th, had made an advance of 1,200 metres, taken 256 prisoners, and seized 3 machine guns. 1. Our commandant, wishing that this feat of arms be noted for posterity, asked that his battalion be officially cited in the orders of the army. But this would have humiliated the other battalions, so let us shed a tear of regret that history will not record how we had conquered a kilometre of swampy marshland and taken 256 Germans who eagerly awaited our arrival so they could stick up their hands and cry out, "Comrades!" In brief, each of us believed himself to be a hero worthy of the days of Homer. But our surly Colonel Robert reminded us of the harsh reality of our servile condition by his draconian prescriptions about our attire, discipline and training, and brought down our hero's pride. He set down severe measures against those who, in the future, would lose their tools, their weapons, their spare rations, or would themselves get lost, or would leave the trench without authorization, or would report to sick bay and not be recognized as sick. To serve as examples, some unfortunate ones who had committed one of these grave crimes were handed over for court-martial. But in war, you can't have leaders who are too sensitive, too eager to preserve the lives of their men. Therefore, one morning, a divisional staff car took away, without trumpets or drums, Commandant Cantegrill, placed on the inactive list, it was said. In the 14th Company, Lieutenant Oranje was reduced to sergeant, for rather unclear reasons. It seems he lacked sufficient decisiveness and sang-froid when Lieutenant Cordier, commanding the company, was wounded and he had to take command. And the training exercises had started up again, with intensity, in all kinds of weather. That was urgently required in order to train, to daze, to stun all these bakers, cooks, orderlies, etc., who had just arrived to take their shares of mud and glory. That's what they really needed. No, they didn't seem to be burning with sacred fire. Instead, they had the lugubrious air of folks who were headed for the gallows. For us, it was amusing to see them like this. It's true that distractions were rare in Aubigny. One little tavern into which barely a dozen people could fit, that's all. What was there to do after the evening meal, in our dark, cold billets? Some played cards by the light of a smoky candle, others to make up for nights spent on watch in the trenches, caught up on sleep. Most went to spend a few hours in nearby villages which offered in their restaurants and taverns a bit more hospitality. Following the course of the Somme upstream, 2 kilometres from Aubigny, was the pretty little town of Corbie. But to get there you had to cross the Somme on a bridge upon which several English sentries severely restricted access without authorization from the military authorities. Corbie was exclusively reserved for the use of the English army. Our allies had put themselves in charge there. The boutiques and shops were stocked with articles from the other side of the channel, and everywhere you saw signs and billboards in the English language. 2. We quickly discovered an easy way to get into Corbie. We stationed ourselves 200 or 300 metres from the bridge and waited for an English vehicle, either an automobile or a truck, then climbed onto it, concealed ourselves, and the trick was completed. In a few minutes we were in the town. The English drivers willingly went along with this stratagem. Going back the other way was easy. The sentries never even gave us a second glance. In September 1914, the Germans had occupied Corbie for 2 weeks, but the inhabitants were unanimous in saying that they had displayed a proper attitude, paying for everything that they acquired. During the fortnight we were at Aubigny, we had the ill luck to find ourselves under a full moon, which earned us nightly visits from the Taubes. 3. Barely had we bedded down when the sinister rumbling of the motors could be heard. They flew overhead, turned and flew back again, and finally we heard the racket of the bombs they dropped around Corbie or Amiens. Here and there some cannon shots would be tossed off toward the moon. The spotters played hide-and-seek with the Taubes, which disappeared only when the sun came to relieve the moon in the firmament. Suddenly, on November 19th, the order came down for the 5th and 6th Battalions in the Corbie sector to leave, that very day, for the front line. Our battalion, the 4th, wouldn't have to leave until the next day. At roll call to reassure us, they read out to everyone that the 296th Regiment was going up to the front line just to prepare the sector that the English would henceforth occupy, which was, it seemed, a great honour. But by now we were on to the rude tricks that our big chiefs tried to play on us. Gloomy, resigned to our fates, worn out with anguish, the men took the road towards suffering, peril, horror, and for many death. And what a death! That same day, the chief of our gun team, Sergeant Gautier, had the coveted good fortune to go home on furlough. Rushing off to Fitou, Aude on the Mediterranean coast between Salcès and La Palme, he left me in charge of the 37mm gun, an honour which was far from flattering to my vanity, since I had to go up to the front line with it, instead of staying in the rear echelon. So on November 20th at 10 in the morning, the trucks carried our battalion toward the trenches. At 3 in the afternoon we tramped through Suzanne, and at 6 p.m. we set ourselves up in a reserve trench behind Combles. Being the last to arrive, we couldn't find any shelter for the night, a long, freezing night. Luckily, our Lieutenant Lorius authorized us to pull back to Hardecourt until our battalion was called up to the front line. Around 10 p.m. we reached Hardecourt, where we had to spend the night rolled up in our blankets under the vans. The cold roused us early. To warm ourselves up, we dug a hole 2 meters square and 1 meter deep, and covered it with tent cloths, a precarious shelter, which a heavy rainstorm would have filled with water. But finally we had a place to sleep, protected from the frigid bice and the damp fog. One soldier who passed by when we were working asked if we were digging a grave. In response to our astonished looks, he showed us a few paces away 6 mounds of freshly dug earth, which we hadn't noticed. These were the tombs of 6 soldiers from the 296th, killed and buried the evening before. We had dug our shelter in the Hardecourt cemetery. A cursed cemetery. The dead couldn't even sleep there in peace. Enormous shells had torn them up, pulverized them, scattered their bones all around, as if in expiation of some terrible punishment. They were going to repopulate this cemetery with fresh meat. It would soon be filled up, no doubt, but now there was room for 6 of us who were still alive. There was no reason to move. We'd be no better or worse off anywhere else. The proximity of dead men didn't bother us. Weren't we condemned men ourselves, sentenced to death, with a stay of execution? Our hole was at the side of a road, across from a flattened house. In the midst of the ruins you could make out a small cellar, which had been a German machine gun nest. The dugout had only one way in or out, under lock and key. The machine gunners had been locked in there, with no way of getting out. What happened at this strong point when Hardecourt was retaken? Had our soldiers rescued the German machine gunners or massacred them? A resourceful son of Périac, François Maisonneuve, a cook at some greasy spoon or other, had discovered this former machine gun nest and had installed his peaceable field kitchen there. Exploring the surroundings of the village that same day, prowling among the mounds of earth and the shredded, blasted trees, I saw a thin line of blue smoke curling up into the air. At the same time, the appetizing aroma of civet, rabbit stew, such as you can smell only in the Midi, caressed my nostrils. Intrigued, I approached, and in a half-buried cellar I saw my Périac friend Richardis among his pots and pans, preparing the menu for the highly placed personages to whose gastronomic needs he administered. To get down into this cellar you had to leap. To get out you had to clamber up, with your hands and feet grabbing holes and bumps in the wall. It lacked comfort, for sure, but it was an unexpected opportunity. You had to be enterprising like a son of Périac to find such a redoubt in the midst of this complete devastation. To amuse ourselves, we sometimes went along the road to see the regiments which had been relieved in the night, coming back from the trenches. What a sad spectacle! The men dragged themselves along, singly or in groups. One soldier, crushed with fatigue, crumpled to the ground beside the road, his feet ravaged by the cold. He begged for someone to go to the nearest pump to fill his canteen. I rushed to carry out his request. During my brief absence, a sergeant major came up and roundly cursed the unfortunate soldier, ordering him to get back on the march. "I'm sick, my feet are half frozen, I need to rest for a moment," pleaded the soldier. This answer, far from softening the officer's heart, only exasperated him even more. Eyes bulging from their sockets, face contorted with anger, he threatened to cite the private for disobedience and shook him by the shoulders. I couldn't hold back my indignation. "Monsieur," I said to him, "you shouldn't act like this in the middle of a regiment from the Midi. We're too proud to put up with it." He turned on me in a rage. "Do you know whom you're talking to? You'd better keep your mouth shut." "Sure, I see your sergeant major's stripes, but even if you were a general, I'd tell you that the military regulations forbid you from laying hands on a subordinate, especially if he claims he's sick. It's the medical officer's business, not yours." "Is there a police station around here?" was all he responded. "To take me to?" "Thanks, but there's no police station in Hardecourt. Here there are only good folks." Exasperated, this nasty sergeant major headed off, not without muttering vain threats toward me and the laggard. with whom I exchanged a fraternal handshake before he moved on, followed closely by his warder. With our battalion due to head up to the front line on November 24th, the preceding evening, I made my way to the reserve trench near Combles to get orders from the head of our group, Lieutenant Lorius. Not far from this trench you could see what the English called a tank broken down in the middle of a field. A squad of lucky fellows had found shelter under its carapace. A big howitzer shell had penetrated it without exploding, and the whole served as a chimney for the soldiers who warmed themselves alongside. Lieutenant Lorius told me that this English tank had contributed to the taking of Combles. But after having sown terror for this device was something new, and death among the Boches, it broke down on its way back from the enemy lines. The English tried in vain to rescue their comrades stuck in the tank, who, rather than surrendering and handing over their vehicle and its secrets, must have set the gas tank on fire. Through the slits in the armour you could see tongues of flame and smoke leaping up, and you could smell the odour of grilled flesh. When Combles was finally taken, they pulled 4 charred bodies out. Heroes, martyrs, or imbeciles? In reality, perhaps they were involuntary victims of an accident, an explosion in the engine. If they were willing victims, they sure were naive to think that their fate would prevent the Germans from building tanks of their own. To spare us further fatigue, Lieutenant Lorius authorized me, for our stint on the front line, to make use of the 37mm field gun, which was already in position, rather than bringing up our own. But unfortunately, we wouldn't be occupying the exact same spot. We therefore had to send up the most enterprising guy in our team to see where the piece was currently positioned, and then to see where our battalion would be stationed, so that he could be our guide the next night. That meant, for this lucky fellow, several hours of scrambling in daylight, in full view of enemy machine guns and shells. Needless to say, nobody in my team offered to be that enterprising. I finally had to draw lots to see who would carry out this mission. It was the gun-layer Koné whom fate selected. He was far from the dumbest, and indeed was one of the cleverest. He investigated the place where the team we were relieving was located, and discovered that the position where we were to link up with our battalion was only a few hundred meters to the left. At 8 in the evening on November 24th, without incident, we relieved Sergeant Maury and his men, who left us their field gun with no regrets and quickly hightailed it out of sight. Loading the cannon and munitions onto our shoulders, we headed to the left, under Koné's direction, to rejoin our battalion, or at least to reach a trench. But at the end of an hour's march, slipping, stumbling, paddling through water and mud, we stopped, worn out, not knowing where we had come from or where we were. A thick fog made the night even blacker. What to do? Wander around on tiptoes like blind men? We could do nothing more than await the arrival of daylight. We sprawled out, immobile, in a shell hole, exchanging no words, no vain condemnations of Koné, himself a victim of having completed his mission badly. We were soaked with sweat, but soon the frigid bice had us shivering, and now the rain took over from the fog. Just what we needed. Ah, what a night to add to so many others, lost on this sinister plain, riddled with cold, under a ceaseless rain. How long it took to appear, this pale, wan November daylight. Koné, to earn forgiveness, went out on patrol, calling to us when he was out of sight. He finally came upon the blasted tree trunks of the Bois de Morval, and a quarter-hour later we reached the Circe dugouts, which we knew from having been there during our previous front-line stint. We cleaned out the entrance of one shelter, which seemed still solid and deep enough, and we installed ourselves inside, where there was a passageway with 5 wooden bunks, just enough of each of us. After having dried out and warmed up by the fire, we managed to light, rested and fortified ourselves with the contents of our haversacks. We took counsel. In my capacity as team leader, I had to find Lieutenant Lorius or the battalion command and get their orders. But where were they? Since our last time at the front, the French had gained ground hereabouts, and despite the guides sent to lead us, our battalion had wandered off and gotten lost, and hadn't reached its positions until 4 in the morning. Parts of frontline units had been relieved and were streaming back. Thanks to them, I'd be able to put together some idea of where we were. I asked for one of my comrades to accompany me, But once again no one sought the honour of coming to join me and explore the charming landscape which was before us. We had to draw lots again. This time it was the gunloader Donadiles, a peasant from Albi, whom fate chose to accompany me. It was now fully daylight, but the rain and thick fog allowed us to move unseen across open country. We followed the course of a rough-hewn boyau which was hemmed in by recent shell holes and dotted with dead bodies abandoned to the voracity of crows. This boyau seemed endless, but in a few minutes we reached a big trench seized from the terrible Hindenburg a few days ago. We saw solidly built dugouts occupied by units of a neighbouring regiment. This was now our second line. A moment later, by way of the Michel boyau, we reached the front line, where we met our Lieutenant Lorius, who was stuck in a little half-collapsed dugout that was just about ready to cave in. After consulting with the commandant, he decided that, with this diluvian downpour which risked making the trenches untenable, we'd be best off staying where we were in our shelter until further orders. Afraid that the commandant would change his mind, we quickly turned on our heels. But this time we had to move along inside the Michel boyau instead of alongside it, because the fog was less thick and we would have been nice targets for the German machine gunners. This boyau, which had seemed to be in good shape the previous evening, was now nothing more than a torrent through which we sometimes had to wade up to our knees. Finally we reached our precious shelter, which we didn't have to leave for the next 5 days. During these 5 days the torrential rain and snow never let up. The walls of the trench were sagging. The precarious shelters which men had dug for themselves collapsed in certain places. Trenches filled with water. It's useless to try to describe the sufferings of the men. Without shelter, soaked, pierced with cold, badly fed no pen could tell their tale. You had to have lived through these hours, these days, these nights, to know how interminable they were in times like these. Proceeding in nightly work details or to and from the front lines, men slipped and fell into shell holes filled with water and weren't able to climb out. They drowned or froze to death, their hands grasping at the edges of the craters in a final effort to pull themselves out. For our part, we were spared all these sufferings, thanks to our precious cannon, which was useless in this storm. Right then, the inventor of the 37 had no idea that, huddled at the bottom of a hole somewhere in the Bois de Morval, 4 enlisted men and a corporal were blessing his name if he was alive, or his memory if dead. The task of our rationers was harder. We could give them only a vague indication of where we were. The first night we took turns at the entrance to our dugout, standing watch for their arrival or responding to their calls. But it wasn't until the next morning that we spotted them in the Bois de Morval after wandering for hours in search of us. From then on their task was easier, and we were rationed regularly, except for one night when, surprised by a barrage of cannon fire, they became separated and one of them wandered off and retraced his steps to Hardecourt. Since he was carrying the liquid part, we had to go 24 hours with meals without drink. A small matter in the middle of such big events. Making my way up to the front lines with some difficulty the next day to get orders from our lieutenant, Lorius, I couldn't find him there. His shelter had completely caved in. He had wisely judged that the place was no longer tenable and had taken off without leaving a forwarding address. The commandant had fallen sick and been evacuated, and no one knew who was commanding the battalion. The companies couldn't communicate with each other. Left to our own devices, we could do nothing but wait out the events in our providential shelter. During our stay at the Circe shelters, we had the occasion to put comrades on the right rodor, rather pathway, and be of help to unfortunate men who had gone astray or were weak with fatigue and cold. For a day we took care of a stretcher-bearer who had stumbled into our dugout after having taken a bath in a big shell hole. He considered himself quite lucky to have been able to pull himself out on his own. We got him undressed, he wrapped himself in our blankets, and once night fell we lit a nice fire on the landing of our staircase and dried out his clothes. Another night we welcomed 2 stretcher-bearers who carried a written order to go identify and bury the bodies which were between the lines. To carry out a task which required several teams, they sent 2 men trembling with fear at each shell blast which shook the shelter. Several times they tried to go out into the dark night, the rain, the fog, but each time they stumbled back precipitously, and finally they decided that they had buried as many of them as they could. Bah, as Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck had said, refusing a ceasefire request to bury the dead the evening after the Battle of Champigny. The dead are as well off on top of the ground as underneath it. On November 29th, our rationers informed us that the battalion was going to be relieved. That very evening, we were to make our way with our field gun back to Hardecourt. In our last relief, volleys of 4 shells rained down every 5 minutes onto the Circe shelters or close by. But this time, instead of a battery, there was now only one cannon which punctually fired its 12 rounds per hour, one every 5 minutes. At nightfall, grouped at the top of the staircase, profiting from the armistice of 300 seconds generously granted us between each falling enemy shell, each of us shouldered our loads and headed out briskly. At an agreed-upon place, our trail boss Castet awaited us with our mule Fallet, and spurred on by Jalabert's cudgel, we soon crossed the danger zone, and at 7 in the evening we made our entry into Hardecourt. There we found our Sergeant Gautier, not at all annoyed to arrive back from furlough the very day of our relief. We spent the night under a big tent cloth called a marabou, a type of wading bird. They had put up a large number of them. They were fragile shelter against the cold, and even less effective against shells, but sufficient against rain, nighttime dampness, and the bice. 2 days later, December 1st, our division was definitively relieved by the English, and the trucks which met us at Suzanne dropped us off at nightfall at Salouel, 4 kilometres from Amiens, which we marched through. Salouel could be called a populous suburb of Amiens, which blends into the villages of Saleux and Pont de Metz, making up a single agglomeration crossed by a river. There are some factories and manufacturing plants. The population was gracious. You could supply yourself with all kinds of things, and finally we had good billets with clean straw. We weren't used to such comforts, and we made the best of them. The day we arrived, they announced that 40% of us would go on home leave, that very night. There was an explosion of joy. Fatigue, suffering, dangers, all were forgotten. Those who weren't going were also happy. Their turns would come sooner than they could have hoped. Who gave a thought to the dead we left back there in the mud? Since the regiment hadn't attacked due to the bad weather, we hadn't had high losses like at the time of our first relief. But the shells had claimed victims every day, even in the quietest sectors. In my old company, the 21st, Hudell's company, my old active duty Sergeant Dahls had been killed by a shell. His brother, a private in the same unit, went to his aid, but a second shell killed him 2 minutes later. This was a simple fact. What did it matter that it was 2 brothers, 2 friends, or 2 strangers? But think about a father and a mother with 2 children, their hope, their help in the future, in their old age, upon whom their thoughts settled, who learn all of a sudden the brutal news, the horrible death of their 2 children. Go talk about glory, victory, the fatherland to these poor old people. They'll ask you not to insult their misery. In the 23rd Company, where I was sent in disgrace when they took away my measly little corporal's stripes, my comrade Escande had been killed, a chunk of his thigh was torn away by a shell fragment. Escande was from Citeaux, a socialist militant of the front rank in a time when that really meant something. How many worthy militants I saw disappear, cut down by machine gun fire. You could say that war took its vengeance on those who hated it the most, and who sought to unite peoples across borders to prevent this monstrous crime. Someone originally from Périac had also found a cruel death during this time on the front lines. His name was François Petit. Up to the age of 12 we played together, as neighbours, and we got our lessons from the same teacher on the benches of our modest schoolhouse. Then he followed his father to South America, and after almost 30 years of absence he had come back when war was declared. Petit was not a fervent patriot, and he was more inspired by pacifist sentiments than by warlike ones. It would doubtless have been better for him to have stayed quietly in the Argentine Republic, but he saw an opportunity to return to France at no cost, thinking that at his age, almost 40, he wouldn't go to the firing line. But he was wrong, and they did him the honour of assigning him to a fighting unit. That's how he fell into the 23rd Company, where my name was duly inscribed next to his on the roster. Sent out on ration detail for the company, he was killed with 4 of his comrades by a barrage of shell fire which took them by surprise. You can imagine what a sweet death he and his unlucky comrades had. To earn the right and the glory of being a hero killed on the field of honour, you have to pay. Before his last home leave, which he spent with relatives who had stayed in Périac, he told me he intended to slip into Spain and make his way back to peaceful South America, where the people weren't caught up in the warlike madness which had poisoned the brains of the inhabitants of the Old World. He had even said farewell and embraced me. But 12 days later he came back to take his place on the front lines, having lacked the decisiveness and the boldness needed to put his plan for flight to Spain into action. A week later, near Morval, he was blown to shreds by a shell. He'd have been better off staying in South America. Who thinks about him now? His name doesn't even appear on the monument erected at Périac to those of its children who died for France, as the epitaph which the patriotic town council had affixed to the monument says so hypocritically. On December 4th, 1916, a corporal named Muller, a Parisian, having all the vices and practicing all the debauches of the capital's lower depths pervert, lover of cocaine, killed with a revolver a girl of 15 years, whose grandmother ran a tavern and whose father was at the front. Ah, if in an occupied village a German had killed a young girl, what our newspapers wouldn't have said to inform their readers about this innocent victim, this martyred virgin, this barely budding flower, cut down by a brutal death, etc., and how they would have described the murderer: sadistic brute, ferocious barbarian, savage beast, cannibalistic executioner. The dictionary couldn't provide enough tarnishing words. The name of this poor girl would have been passed to posterity, and her misery perhaps cited in the history of France, to kindle hatred against the Germans. But alas, the murderer was a Frenchman, and we have to keep silent about this crime, which was kept out of official dispatches. Many soldiers of the 296th Regiment didn't know what happened, and I wouldn't have known about it if our Lieutenant Lorius hadn't told me, knowing that I was writing the history of our tragic epic. It was evening, in a tavern. Corporal Muller, drunk, was waving a revolver around and pointed it at the granddaughter of the landlady, saying, "Say chiche," French slang for, "I dare you bet you can't." The child, thinking it was a joke, called out, "Chiche!" Muller pulled the trigger of his revolver, which he says he thought wasn't loaded, and the bullet tore through the neck artery. Without a cry, a word, the girl fell dead. You can imagine the emotions aroused in Salouel by this tragic, stupid death. The corporal was arrested right away and brought before a court-martial a few days later. The victim's family had the generosity to intervene on his behalf and sought the indulgence of the judges toward Müller, who was sentenced to just 2 years in prison. But this deplorable event had unfortunate consequences for us, as if 2,000 men were responsible, in solidarity with the act of one bandit. All our prowess, all our dazzling actions, for which they couldn't find enough elegiac words to congratulate us, carried no weight in the decision of our big bosses, who chased us out of Salouel and sent us into a tiny village devoid of all comforts. So on December 6, 1916, the 296th Regiment, in grey weather and a glacial bis, left Salouel with much regret and marched 12 kilometres to encamp in the village of Briquemesnil, Somme. It was nightfall when we made our far-from-triumphal entry into Briquemesnil. An old peasant, 3 youngsters, and 12 geese were the sole witnesses to our arrival at this place of exile. In this little village, with mainly tumble-down houses grouped around a stinking pond, there was no tavern where you could go to sit down, quench your thirst, restore your strength or your spirits. There was only a tiny grocery store run by an ill-tempered gossip, and a single communal well which occupied what appeared to be the public square. This well was 90 metres deep, and to bring up some of the cloudy, whitish water required no less than 150 turns of the handle, a 2-man operation, if you didn't want to have your shirt soaked through with sweat. Our cooks lined up early in the morning around the well, to the vexation of the inhabitants, who claimed that the well would soon dry up, forcing them to buy water from neighbouring villages. Our whole 4th machine gun company was billeted in the upper story of a large barn. To get up there you had to climb up the wall, on the outside, by a ladder which barely reached the window, a simple opening in the wall, and hoist yourself up by sheer arm strength. For the young guys, this was a game, but for those like me who were nearing 40, it was a dangerous exercise. The first time I climbed into our bedroom, I almost ended up face down on the paving stones below. This motivated me to seek lodgings elsewhere. In a corner of the courtyard, I was lucky enough to find some pig pens, deemed uninhabitable for those beasts, with unhinged doors, holes in the roof, openings in the crumbling walls. But I rushed to take possession of the least dilapidated of them. Just in time, 2 others were taken by storm a few minutes later, being reduced to the state of disputing with each other over half-demolished pig pens that's war for you. And we still thought we were lucky to be there, sheltered from the rain, from bullets, from shells, from poison gas. Little by little, we were being taken over by the instincts of primitive men. I fixed up my precious redoubt the best I could. I stuffed with paper the holes in the wall which the bice blew through. I closed up the rat holes with broken glass. A bit of straw framed with bricks made my bed. A plank stuck to the wall served as my dresser. My knapsack was my pillow, desk, and briefcase. For lighting, I transformed an English hand grenade into a kerosene lamp. In brief, I had a fairly long sojourn there, where I could read, write, and sleep in peace and quiet, far from the noise and hubbub of the main encampment. From time to time, in the evening, we'd go into the village of Bougainville, variation of Bougainville, 4 kilometres away, where it was possible to get provisions and spend a few pleasant moments seated in a warm, well-lit cafe. Just think of it, to take a round trip of 8 kilometres at night in the dead of winter, to enjoy a bit of warmth, of light, of well-being. That shows how much we wanted to chase away, to dissipate, our boredom and our homesickness. From the day after our arrival, as if to punish us for the crime at Salouel, the training exercises so detested by the men started up again, despite the cold and occasional rain. Once, when our lieutenant and the 3 sergeants of our squad had gone off on a mission or on leave, I had to take command of the group. Since this great honour was accompanied by many worries and few advantages, I cursed this annoying occurrence, despite the fact that they left us pretty much alone. Who would have thought at the end of July 1914, when, in my simple barrel-maker's workshop, I handled the peaceful tools of my trade saws and planners, that one day I would command a group of field guns and their gunners. Alas, I was no more proud of that than I was of my peacetime tools and peace itself. And Christmas arrived. The only difference from other days was that we didn't go out for training. But that day the newspapers, in huge letters, announced the sensational peace proposal of Emperor Wilhelm of Germany. There was a flash of hope which was soon snuffed out. The servile newspapers, under orders from the madmen who governed us, shouted with joy, with gladness, figuring that if the emperor was making such an offer, it proved he must be running out of everything: money, food, munitions. We must not negotiate, they said, but rather prepare ourselves for the supreme effort, the final death knell, the execution of the exhausted, beaten enemy. By resisting for 2 more years, Germany proved that she still had the means to continue the war, and that our governors had lied. To be sure, I don't seek to defend the odious Kaiser, the living incarnation of haughty, brutal authoritarian militarism. But he did make a gesture which honours him, by inviting the leaders of the warring peoples to try to meet and reach agreement to stop the shedding of blood. By refusing to listen to or even acknowledge the emperor's proposals, under the pretext that they could not be sincere, our leaders assumed an immense responsibility before history, and gave the leading role to the Kaiser. Around the end of December, we learned that our regiment was leaving the 9th Corps and moving to the 8th, which left us completely indifferent. Out of 20 men, there were perhaps 19 who had no idea what corps they belonged to. But this event could not be allowed to pass unnoticed, and on January 6, 1917, a farewell ceremony took place, a few kilometres from the village. All the troops of the division, with their flags and bands, were there. The weather was freezing, and we had to spend 3 hours marching, parading, and presenting arms. Finally, they formed us up in a square, and the division's general gave a fitting speech, a great elegy, exalting our warlike virtues, and said that our regiment was now a well-tempered weapon of war. He declared that the thought of our departure brought tears to his eyes. Alas, this war has brought us many more separations, even sadder and more wrenching, for us to be moved by this one. The next day, January 7th, we left Briquemisnil to rejoin our new army corps, and after having marched all day, we arrived that night at the village of Morville, Somme. This village was hardly any more attractive than Briquemisnil. It was made up of 3 hamlets. The church was in the middle of the fields. For our billet, our group had a barn with daub and wattle walls, that is to say, of straw and hardened earth, riddled with holes. On one side there was a crevice which a man could easily pass through, not to mention the wind, the rain, the bice. For a mattress there was a sleeping platform, which might as well have been a manure pile, where legions of lice must have swarmed. Clearly my pig pen at Briquemisnil was a villa compared to our new campsite.